Hello, I am Abigail Miller, and I did my research project over George A. Miller. He is an American psychologist, most notably recognized for his paper on the magic number 7 plus or minus 2 that was published in 1956. From this paper, Miller rose to prominence in the field of psychology. Miller was one of the leading figures during the cognitive psychology revolution that began in the 1950s out of frustration with the strict behavioralist approach to psychology. Miller, with some of his colleagues, developed problem-solving theory called TOTE. This theory that Miller and colleagues developed would later be used in other areas outside of psychology, such as engineering and AI. Miller also looked forward to towards other disciplines to help answer questions in the field of psychology. Most notably would be his work with Noam Chomsky, a distinguished linguist, to answer questions regarding speech. And they both formed what is called WordNet, which I will get into later in the presentation. And this is a English lexical database. So George Miller was born February 3rd in 1920. The city that he lived in and then would eventually graduate high school from was Charleston in West Virginia. His parents were George E. Miller and Florence Miller. His family practice, which is called Christian Science. This is faith relies on prayer over medical science for healing. Like I said, he did graduate from high school in 1937 from Charleston High School. It's a public school. And then he would later move to Washington, D.C. with his mother and stepfather. His mom and dad did divorce when he was younger, but his mom would later remarry, and then they would move to Washington, D.C., and that is where he first started college at George Washington University, but he was only there for 1 year before transferring to University of Alabama. So we're going to continue on with his life and what he has done. So George participated in drama club while attending University of Alabama. His interest in drama actually is what propelled him to one of his degrees, and that was in speech. He also double majored in history as well. But it was during his time at the University of Alabama that he developed an interest in psychology with taking a seminar class from a Professor Randall's Donald Ramsels. This is actually where he would meet his wife, his future wife, Catherine. They both attended this seminar, and they developed a friendship that later developed into them getting married. Then he graduated in 1940 from the University of Alabama, and then he also completed his master's degree in 1 year from the University of Alabama in speech. Then he became an instructor at the University of Alabama for about 2 years, and what he did there was he helped instruct intro to psychology, actually. But he started taking classes in 1942 up at Harvard. But he wasn't full-time yet until the fall of 1943 for their PhD program in psychology. And he really wanted to get into experimental psychology, but then he noticed that because of his background in speech, he had much more of a interest in getting into the psychology of speech. And while attending Harvard for his PhD, he also served in the military under the Army Signal Corps. While he was there, doing his work for the Army Signal Corps while using the psychoacoustic laboratory at Harvard, he was looking at voice communications, and more specifically, he was looking at the optimal design of masking signals for spot jamming of voice communication. So he wanted to make sure that what was being communicated at its most effectiveness. And that is also what he wrote his dissertation on as well. So then he graduated from Harvard not long after, and then also started instructing psychology classes there, like Intro to Psych. He also started working in their laboratory as well. But he did that for about till 1951, and then he went and took a position at MIT in 1951 to about 1955. Then he came back to Harvard and was working there as he was appointed a assistant. He was actually offered a tenure position at Harvard, and he held that position for a while up until he became like the head of the psychology department in 1964 to about 1967, before he moved on to the Rockefeller University in 1968 to about 1982. Even though he was still teaching at the Rockefeller University, he also started doing things for Princeton University in about 1979, and he also helped establish the Cognitive Science Laboratory in 1986. And he also directed the McDonald's Pew program in cognitive science. The work of George Miller is what we're going to move on to next. So his first thing, which really brought him to prominence, like I said in the intro, was his paper on the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. And he looked at different tasks for individuals to complete. And a couple of those tasks, because there's 3, but I'm going to focus on 2 of them, is the identifying tones or like pitches and like line lengths was one of the tasks. And the participants would learn these arbitrary categories, whether it's like the pitch or like the tone or like say the length. Now they would teach them like this, like the units, and they would then have to say what they have seen. And he identified that on average it was 7 that people could recall. Now the most famous task that what most people think of when they think of 7 plus or minus 2 is the being able to recall a list of items in order that they were given. And again, on average, that was about 7 plus or minus 2. Like some people were able to get up to 5, some people were actually able to get up all the way up to 9. But for the most part, people on average had 7. And this is where Miller came up with 2 different ideas to help with, say, short-term memory, and that is chunking and recording. Chunking is when you're making like the groups, when you're grouping up things into like similar groups, and then recording, which is like rewriting information into smaller, denser forms. So this is like in the article that I read is, say if you have a 5-page research paper that you read, write a page of it, like reduce it down. So that's recording, or you're trying to get the most information that you can in the smallest amount of writing that you can do. The next thing that they looked at was called TOTE, and he developed this along with Eugene and Carl. And what it is it stands for test, operate, test, exit. And what it is a feedback loop to test and assess a situation till the desired outcome is achieved and is successful. And once it's successful, then that's the desired outcome. So you're done with the feedback. And that's so you're just trying to adjust something until you get the end result that you want. Now, there's WordNet that Noam Chomsky and him developed together. Like I said, Noam Chomsky is a linguist, while Miller is a psychologist, but he focused on, say, speech. And so them teaming up together is really fun and exciting because they developed this thing called WordNet, and we'll get more into like the implications of this later. But what it is a database of words that are linked by their semantic relationship. So this is, as you can see here in the picture, there is the word temperature, and then like there's different things that go off from it and how those link together. And we'll talk more about how this is important in the future of its use. Now, the last thing that we're going to look at is his work with cognitive science. He is one of the founders of it. I say one of because there is several people. And what he suggested was cognitive science is a field of psychology that brings in several different other fields into one, and he thought of 6, and they kind of expanded on this since then, but there are 6 main ones, and he suggested philosophy, linguists, anthropology, neuroscience, computer science, and obviously psychology. He looked at those 6 disciplines, and he felt like those were the ones that were at like the most pinnacle at the time. And so they all met at this and did like a little conference, and they brought in experts from each one of these fields, and they each wrote like a little paper on like how their field contributes to cognitive science. And they submitted that to an editorial board, which Miller was a part of. Not only did he write the whole theory behind why, but he was also part of the board. And then in 1978, cognitive neuroscience became a field of study all on its own. And this is like from that little conference that they had and putting together everything. They also had to get all sorts of funding, and it was a lot that they had to do. Now we're going to look at Miller's impact. Miller, with his magic number +or -7 +or -2. So he looked at the limitations of short-term memory, and how is this important today? Well, this is the whole reason why our phone numbers are about 7 to 9 digits long. This is why our zip codes are the way that they are. We have 5 main digits, and then for our actual, like, say, home location, or like the actual location where you are, where you get your mail dropped off, has its additional 4 digits. And the reason why they designed it that way was actually from his paper, and they used that as an argument towards not making, say, our phone numbers longer, and to make our zip codes not any longer than, say, 9 digits. And he also brought in chunking and how you can group things together to help increase that short-term memory, and as a strategy that now we use, say, in education. Then there's WordNet. Like I said, we were going to get to this later. And what this is a group of sunsets, which are cognitive synapses. And how this is impactful today is this is how our search engines work, like Google. And or if you're going to look up a product on Amazon and you want to look at it for like a specific chair, like you want a chair that has lumbar support, well, it's going to bring up all of these chairs with lumbar support, and you get to choose from a list, right? So it's kind of cool like how this works, because also this is like when you're trying to look up like an article or something like that, this is also how you're able to type in different keywords, but yet you might still get some like articles that are still popping up as the same, because it's going based off of these sunsets, which are the cognitive synonyms of these words. Yeah, this is how Google works, essentially. And then TOTE is used primarily in engineering, artificial intelligence, so AI, and cybernetics. Also, neuro-linguistic programming is used this way, but it's not really considered a valid approach because it doesn't use the scientific method. But it is still widely important because of engineering. I mean, those engineers are going to be testing, retesting until they get the final result that they want. And this is how that's done. Test, operate, test, test, operate, test, test, operate, test until you can exit. Now we're going to get into some of his awards and recognitions. So he has over 160 publications and many awards and honors, some of which was the National Medal of Science in 1991, given to him by George H.W. Bush. He also has some honorary degrees from the University of Sussex, Columbia University, Yale, the Catholic University of Leuven. I don't know how to pronounce that, but he has an honorary degree from there. George received awards such as Distinguished Science Contribution Award of the American Psychology Association. He's a Distinguished Services Award of the American Speech and Hearing Association. Like I said, his background is in speech. Then the Warren Medal from the Society of Experimental Psychologists. Miller was also elected as president of the Eastern Psychology Association and also for the American Psychology Association. Now, some last bits about him is that his wife Catherine did pass in 1996. When she passed, she left behind George, their 2 kids, and 2 grandchildren. George remarried in 2008 to a woman named Margaret, and then he would later pass in July 2020, or July 22nd, 2012. And when he passed, he actually had 3 grandchildren and his 2 kids and Margaret that were surviving. Now, he would be best remembered as being kind and helpful to his students. He would also, his colleagues, talked about his love of travel, especially to Mexico, to, oddly enough, help him think better about work. And his children remember him bringing his students home for like things like such as Thanksgiving, or if his students were ever hungry. Now, here are my resources.